May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Cuke Audio podcast. I'm DC, Poobah of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, preserving the legacy of Shunryu Suzuki and those whose paths crossed his, and anything else that comes to mind. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable, free from economic stress, and able to get out and do whatever it is you want within the confines of the universal precept of do as little harm as possible. Today we have couple of pieces of the work in progress Tassajara Stories. So, after the pause to meditate, we will get right into it with a visit to Maggie Cress. So, when the bell rings, hit pause, if you wish, and meditate or whatever for as long as you wish. And when you're through and ready to come back, hit unpause. And we'll be here to hit the bell to end meditation just at that time. Maggie Cress. Margaret Cress. Jack Elias and I were talking about Maggie Cress and what a character she was. He recalled an exchange she had with Suzuki in a Shosan ceremony. Maggie presented herself, he said. She seemed somewhat shy and perhaps even lacking in self-esteem. Yet she asked the most outrageous question given the context. She said something to the effect of, "Roshi, what if I don't care about getting enlightened? Can I still practice?" Roshi very passionately responded, "Just stay honest and open the way you are right now." I have forgotten most things over the past 40 years, Jack said, but that moment of Maggie stays in my heart. Maggie came from New York City and had been, according to her, hanging out with a bunch of dope-smoking hippies in Bolinas. She found out there was Zazen on Monday mornings with Bill Kwong's group in Mill Valley, not far away. She'd long been interested in Buddhism and meditation, so she went. She showed up late after Zazen was over. There was a folding screen inside the front door of the Altamont Recreation Club where Bill's group met. She could hear someone speaking. She took a peek. She'd had a picture in her mind of a bunch of hippies sitting around a fireplace with incense and lots of color, and instead there were people sitting straight in rows, some with black robes. "It was all very formal and beautiful to me," she said. "I sat and listened to Suzuki Roshi give a lecture, but I couldn't see him. And I was caught right away. There was something very powerful about him even that way. Maggie signed up for a week-long session. She checked into some horrible old hotel, and I was scared and thought I was going to die. That fear followed her to the session and expressed itself in dread she wouldn't be up for the challenge. In zazen, she felt like she was going to be sick. During a break, she asked Silas if she could sit outside. He said no and asked why did she want special attention. She cowered at that, sat down and vomited in the Shinto all over the pillow and herself. A few hours later, she was sitting in a Sokoji pew next to the aisle, waiting for a lecture by Katagiri. As he walked by on his way to the front, he handed her something and said, "Here, Tums for the tummy. Don't be sick." That's how they met. Her first interaction with Suzuki came when she was carrying a vase to go to the altar. Suzuki looked her straight in the eye and said, "Don't drop it." She told Silas that she took that to mean not to let her attention to each thing she did drop. Silas said that's a good way to take that, but also she was carrying it with one hand, and Japanese, especially monks, carry anything precious with two hands. When Maggie first arrived at Tassajara, she was striking with her long, bleached blonde hair, animated, energetic, talkative. She hadn't been there long when she was taught how to hit the mokugyo for service. She felt uptight, worried she'd screw it up, lose the rhythm. Richard Baker's seat on the altar was right next to the mokugyo. As service was starting and Suzuki was approaching the altar to offer incense, Baker leaned over to Maggie, who was sitting rigidly upright with a concerned look on her face, and whispered, "I love your hair. Who did it?" "Sassoon." She said that was just the right thing to say to make her relax. She called herself a refugee from the New York Andy Warhol scene. She said he was quiet, a zero, that everything else happened around. "Like Suzuki Roshi," I said. "In that way only," she responded. A friend of hers from the Warhol crowd came as a guest. He and Alan Marlowe sat at a table outside the guest dining room, got along splendidly, and talked loudly about the gay bar scene in New York City. I got more into the conversation when it turned to film, and I learned he'd been in Trash, a movie I'd seen and written a song for. People called it a Warhol film, but he said it was really a Paul Morrissey film. And Morrissey did Warhol's best film work. Maggie said she loved Suzuki's lectures. I asked how she could love them when she told me she would fall asleep almost immediately. She said he'd say, "That's okay, because maybe when you're asleep you can understand what I'm saying better than when you're awake." She said she grew up in a home that was like a museum, and that she was afraid to touch anything, that she felt like she was living in an extension of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which was just across the street. She said her family wasn't rich anymore. I said, "That's what rich people tend to say." "No, we're not," she insisted. "My uncle made the money, and my father lost it." I asked what sort of business was that. "Dime stores," she said. Kretz, 5 and dime. They called them department stores. Maggie would talk about Europe and a private Catholic girls' school she attended in Italy. She said the nuns made them take baths with a sheet hiding their bodies. But then she said she'd sleep with her best friend there, who became her first love. I was standing in the courtyard when Maggie saw a woman walk by on the road above. "Oh, my gosh," she said, "that's Millie Johnston." I asked who that was, and she said Millie was an East Coast socialite whose husband ran U.S. Steel. Millie was an older, sophisticated woman involved with Ada's New York Zen studies. During the day, she'd do tea ceremony for students. A couple of days later, Maggie told me she'd been a guest for tea ceremony with Millie. Her first tea ceremony, which she found to be like an exquisite meditative dance while seated. And then in a whispered voice she said, Millie had a pet wolf who killed her 5-year-old son, and she couldn't stop the wolf from eating him. She wrote a book about it. One day, Maggie found a baby bird that had fallen from its nest. She wanted to help it, so she beat up some egg yolks, squeezed the yellow liquid into its mouth, and it keeled over dead. She asked Suzuki in a lecture, "Why, when you try to help, does it often just cause more trouble?" He said that if you see a cat playing with a mouse and try to stop it, that the mouse will tell you to stop interfering with its karma. I think it was an old Japanese story, she said. Another time, Maggie came into the dining room, pointed to one of the guests waiting for dinner outside and said, "That's Billy Hitchcock. He owns Millbrook, where Timothy Leary and all the acid people lived." Alan Marlowe, who'd also lived there, knew Hitchcock well and said, "He's on my shit list for ratting people out so they could go to prison instead of him." Maggie asked Alan what he'd do if he were threatened with so much time he'd come out an old man. Maggie asked Suzuki a question after lecture in his cabin. She remembered their first interaction when he told her not to drop the vase. He had a cup in his hand, she said, and he had been talking about attachment to things in his lecture, and I said, "Roshi, if you drop the cup and it breaks, to me it's no big deal, but if you fall down and are broken, then that's something terrible." And he said, "There's no difference between me and the cup." Something like that. And then something like, "You don't understand what I've been trying to teach you. You don't realize the sameness between me and everything else around." Well, I didn't understand that then or ever, she said. Maggie and Nils went out in the flatbed to get a load of chicken manure for the garden. It was a hot day. They were both pretty hard-headed and got into some sort of argument about how to load it and then how to unload it. It was gooey, and their clothes and arms were decorated with a splattering of that goo. As she shoveled it out, Nils started making fun of how Maggie operated the shovel. She got pissed and shoveled some onto his feet. He returned the favor. Pretty soon they were plastered with chicken shit all over. "Everything smelled and tasted like chicken shit for a few days," she said. After that, they could be found hanging out a lot together. Walter. Bob and Audrey Walter were at Tassajara during the visit of all those Zen teachers. They were students of Tai-san's and had been eager to try out Tassajara after hearing Richard Baker give a talk at the Zen Studies Society in the fall of 1967. They hadn't been with Soen or Yasutani before. Just watching Soen walk, I was blown away, Bob said. The first day Yasutani talked and I got emotional. All Soen said at that time was, "No tomorrow." It was so powerful. Bob would sit sesshin with both those teachers in time to come. He would know many teachers, all more exciting than Shunryu Suzuki. We had an East Coast student who'd tried to sit with Tai-san first, but been told on the phone not to bother to come if he couldn't sit full lotus. Bob said that Tai-san would show great favor to zealous sitters, attractive women, and the wealthy. Sometimes his discrimination would be embarrassing, as when he made the only black student sit in the kitchen. When I first met Suzuki Roshi, I was disappointed, he said. He was a little guy up there on the altar, speaking softly. I had doubt, but little by little I got impressed and saw what he had to offer. He didn't make a strong impression like Soen Nakagawa Roshi, but Suzuki treated us like family. He was inclusive. The Walters arrived early in the 1968 guest season. Their son and daughter were just old enough to work in the gardens. Audrey was assigned to cabin cleaning and Bob to get stones and wheelbarrow cement for Dan Welsh and Bill Shurtleff, who were building walls for the new kitchen. Bob mentioned to them that Audrey was a stone sculptor, and she got the job of making the cornerstones. Suzuki watched Audrey working, saw she knew what she was doing, and began to spend time with her on that and other stone work. For me, she said, it was a special period of learning, sharing the love of stone, mindful hits, the slow revealing of form, and the opportunity to speak with Roshi about Zen practice, just by a brief reference to the work at hand. One day he suggested we look for a river rock to cut for a lantern. I was amazed at his agility and quickness as he happily stepped from stone to stone along the creek bed, asking me what I thought here and there, then spotting without hesitation the right one for the job, a long, somewhat rectangular rock. It was winched up and then dragged by sled to its work location and stood on end. A 4-sided opening was cut near the top, allowing space for a candle. Where was the lantern going? What should it look like? Roshi wouldn't say. He was coy. Just cut. Well, of course, later I found out it was sent to New York as a gift for Tai-san Zendo. Never during the cutting process was I given room for the attendant anxieties that might arise from thoughts such as where, when, for whom, or is this work adequate? Before the Walters left to go back to the East Coast, Suzuki asked Audrey if she'd make a Buddha. She said she'd bring one back when they returned. On the East Coast, she found an old granite gravestone that she thought was just right. In the library, she studied books with Buddhist iconography to get the dimensions right. The granite was so hard that she kept breaking her chisels, even after she bought special carbide tips. When she got to the mudra, she broke a thumb off and had to carve in deeper to redo it. The next summer, they drove their van across the country and brought the statue to Suzuki, who was delighted. He placed it on a base stone on the dorm side of the bridge over Kabarga Creek that the stone came from. Several years later, Bob was back doing stonework on the wall outside the dining room and overheard a student showing some guests around say that the statue was very old, probably 13th century Chinese. Bob said his first steps on the path were at the age of 8, when he had a sense that everything was a dream. It was a deep opening that frightened him. He thought of that epiphany when he first read the Diamond Sutra. As an older child, he had an out-of-body experience, a half-sleep, half-wake state, feeling like a ball rolling around the room. It was pleasurable, but it frightened him too because he didn't know what was happening. He went to Duke University on a baseball scholarship. His grades weren't good enough, but he said they had the best college baseball team in the country, and the coach wanted him. He played semi-pro in the summers, got into philosophy, and especially liked Heidegger, Kierkegaard, and George Berkeley's mind-only approach. He had a major in sociology because he wanted to do social work, but became a psychologist whose mentor was the eminent Rollo May. I recall May as a quiet and dignified Tassajara guest. Bob came to have doubts about psychiatry, which he likened to DDT. Looks good, but doesn't help in the long run. Can even worsen mental disturbances, he said. He and May attended a week of lectures by R.D. Laing that strongly reinforced the direction Bob's thoughts were already heading. Do less, prescribe less, be supportive, but leave the patients alone more to transform on their own. Bob's professional lineage traced back through May's mentor, Erich Fromm, who had published a book on Zen and psychoanalysis with DiMartino. He valued the guidance he'd received, but knew he had to push ever onward toward the unknown. R.D. Laing was inspiring, but clearly unstable himself. Then the director of the clinic in New York where Bob worked jumped out of the window to his death. Bob went to a workshop with Alan Watts in Connecticut. Watts said that psychotherapy is prostitution. Bob knew there was truth in that, but also that Watts was being flippant. He drove Watts back to New York and found Watts had another side, charming and humble. Watts actually valued psychoanalysis and, like Fromm, wrote about the synthesis of it and Zen. He also valued psychedelics. So did Bob. Bob took LSD, which gave new meaning to the term fantastic. Everything was brilliant. It opened up doors. He only took a couple of trips, but thought it was a great key, was grateful for the experience, but decided that's enough of that. Bob made a friend whom he called his first Zen teacher, Jack Kerouac. They met playing softball with artist friends in Northport on Long Island. Due to the company he kept and the paint on his clothes, Kerouac thought Bob was an artist. Kerouac hated therapists. Bob said one reason for that was he'd been kicked out of the Army for inadequate personality. Bob said they had instant contact. When Kerouac learned Bob was a psychologist, he went, "Oh my God!" Bob said Kerouac was a fantastic baseball player who did zany things on the field, would do flips, twirl around, and fall on his face. Audrey got along well with Kerouac and was impressed not only with his athleticism, but also with his broad knowledge of literature and the literary scene. However, she wasn't going out drinking with him like Bob. Bob said, "We'd go on drinking trips. He called me his psychiatrist, and I called him my Zen teacher. He was spontaneous, dramatic. He was also disturbed and an alcoholic. He had the ability to create great social situations, a bit like Bob Alpern. But also he was frightened to death of people. He'd hide under his bed when somebody knocked on his door. I've seen him be defensive and hostile on TV, but he could be beautiful. Like Watts, get below their defenses, and they can quickly change." Ah, an airplane. Not many of them. That's unusual to hear. Since COVID. Coming back from Fire Island one time, Kerouac said to me, "You're just like Neil Cassidy," and he started to cry. Kerouac saying that to Bob gives a peek into Bob's personality. Cassidy was Kerouac's best friend and principal subject of his On the Road, a frenetic, impulsive, wild man. There were also traces of that in Bob, no matter how much he matured and mellowed. Bob said that Kerouac would play with people, like Halpern. But unlike Halpern, Kerouac would get drunk and into fights, and then he'd disappear, and Bob would have to deal with the situation. Once they got separated and Kerouac got arrested after an altercation in a bar, he had no money because he'd give it all to his mother to dole out to him, and then he'd give what she gave him to Bob. Bob used it to bail him out. Kerouac also carried no identification. He told the police he didn't need any because he was the famous Jack Kerouac. They didn't believe him. Bob told them, and they finally believed. Sometimes he'd stay with Bob and Audrey, and then he might bring someone home from the bar, either sex. One night, they also had other friends visiting whom Kerouac kept up with the racket he was making, getting it on with someone. In the morning, he emerged with what Bob described as an old alcoholic man. Bob said they do things such as listen all night to Handel's Messiah, or Kerouac might call up Allen Ginsberg and have long talks with him. Allen knew that Jack's mother was a bigot who hated blacks and Jews. Jack handed Bob the phone, and Allen said, "Tell Jack the only thing he should do is fuck his mother." Ouch. I told Bob when he was visiting in about 2010 that I thought I remembered him telling me that Kerouac was filled with guilt from having had sex with his mother, but Bob said no, he didn't, but that there was that sort of talk. Kerouac married a woman and moved to Nantucket. He was hoping she'd take care of his mother, but it didn't work out. They moved to Florida with his mother because his sister lived there, and he wanted her to take care of his mother. He'd promised his father he'd see she was taken care of, but he also wanted to be free to travel. He didn't get that wish, Bob said, and he died the same as Trungpa, pretty young and with cirrhosis of the liver. Bob started talking to his patients about Zen. One of them went to the Zen studies Zendo, started sitting there and told Bob to stop bullshitting and start sitting. Bob talked to Audrey, who eagerly went first. She arrived an hour early. Tai-san gave her a brief instruction, and she sat full lotus for an hour and then joined others for the 40-minute period. When Tai-san met Bob, he said, "Your wife is a Zazen genius. You we're going to have to work on." A Jesuit priest struggling with his homosexuality and considering leaving the order came to Bob, who suggested they sit Zazen together. The priest said it was the first time he'd had any spiritual feeling and decided not to quit. He had to do a retreat every year to fulfill a Jesuit requirement, so he went to Tassajara in the summer of '69 when Bob was there, and he worked with him in the dining room. Bob wouldn't relate to him there as his patient. When he had first come in '68, he'd offered to counsel students, and Baker had told him while there to forget psychology. He decided that was good advice. He and Audrey attended the practice period in the fall of 1969. I remember an exchange between Suzuki Roshi and Ken Berman, who was young, he said, young and idealistic and sincere. It happened during the Shosan ceremony at the end of the practice period. We were all quite conscious of the war in Vietnam, and this student was a pacifist. Speaking hypothetically, he asked something like, "I'm married and have a wife and children, and an intruder comes into our home and wants to kill us. What do? Do I kill him? Do I let him kill my family?" Suzuki Roshi responded, "Kill yourself." Hearing that was like a lightning jolt to Bob, who saw then that by dropping the illusory self, whatever comes, one wouldn't have to ask someone else what to do. Bob left Tassajara to do sessions with Alan Raybould. They sat a week-long session with Maizumi in L.A., and then did the same with Chinese Zen master Dao Lun at his Gold Mountain Temple in San Francisco. From monks there, they got the idea to do a 100-day session, which they did at Phil Lewitt's Big River Farm in Mendocino. The general attitude at the Zen Center was that this was not Suzuki Roshi's way. That was true. Suzuki encouraged daily sitting and said a single one-week session a year was enough. Two's okay. Two's good. But he could appreciate enthusiastic extremes as well, if he thought it was done in the right spirit. Bob said, "I returned to the city center and said I wanted to talk to Suzuki Roshi and was told I was not a real student, so I was way down on the list. I was working in the building a few days later and had to go to Suzuki's apartment and ask some question. Suzuki stuck his head out after I had rung the bell and said, 'Just a minute.' Then he returned and asked with visible excitement, 'How was it?' I said, 'I'll tell you when I see you,' and bowed. When I did see him and tell him about it, he was totally supportive. I told him about the inner sound that I was experiencing, and he said that was enlightenment. And I'd taken good care of myself, and now I had to take care of everything. I said, 'What do you mean by that?' And he picked up a pencil on his table and said, 'You have to take care of this.' And he picked up something else and he said, 'And this.' And he kept picking things up and saying that. My interpretation was that he was saying you have to take care of all sentient beings. I wanted to go to L.A. to join Soen in the sesshin, Bob said. It was the last summer Suzuki Roshi was at Tassajara, and he was giving everything he had. I could feel his sense of urgency. I went to see him about going to the sesshin with the idea in mind that there's nothing he could do to stop me. He said, "The reason you're not going to sesshin is that you're my student now, and when I die, you can be Soen's student." I walked out stunned. No way was I going to that sesshin. I felt good about it. Bill Shurtleff and Dan had taught Walter about stonework when he was there in '68. Shurtleff was work leader when Walter returned in '71 and put him on stonework, some of which he did with Suzuki. Suzuki had said in a lecture that he only gave talks because he was expected to, but that he'd rather just sit zazen and work. Bob was happy to oblige. He helped to move the heavy stone up the hill for the ashes site with Mel, Reb, Dan, and Jeff Sherman, and a motorized winch. The massive stone was on the steel sled made from the hood of an old truck. Slow going, moved it a few feet at a time. They got to the very top and the chain broke. Bob said they were scared it was going to slide down, but it didn't. Sighs of relief. Suzuki was there to make sure the stone was set just right in the exact spot he wanted. Suddenly, Bob was aware that Suzuki was setting his own gravestone. So there are a couple of more pieces from the work in progress, Tassajara Stories. Now come back next week, same time, and there'll be some more. If my recording area and me survive the construction that's going on in the house, a future guest here kindly donated half the funds necessary for a guest room. So far we will have half of it built, and work is just starting. And I better zip downstairs and see what needs to be done, because there's a lot to do today. This has been a Cuke Audio podcast. I'm DC Poobah of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, coming to you from sleepy Sanur with Dogette Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka. And we're wishing you and yours and all of us a grand awakening.